Hello and welcome to Conversations with Disability Rights North Carolina. I'm Tori Ekstrand. I'm an associate professor at the UNC Hussman School of Journalism and Media. And I'm really happy today to be joined by Holly Stiles, who is litigation counsel for DRNC. Holly works on cases involving accessible documents and communication, including accessible voting. And she's been fighting for the rights of the disability community now as a lawyer for over a decade. Holly, along with attorneys from the National Federation of the Blind and Duke MBA graduate Mary Fernandez, recently filed a lawsuit against Duke University. That suit charged that Duke failed to ensure that blind students can interact with digital content and platforms and access course materials, including hard copy Braille materials and hard copy tactile graphics when requested and appropriate, on an equal basis with students without disabilities. So simply put, the lawsuit is about the ability of blind students to access the web, access their course materials in the same way as typical students do. And so we're so happy to have Holly here today to talk a little bit about the case and talk more generally about accessibility for students, particularly in higher education. So thanks, Holly, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so can you tell us a little bit first about the case and what led Ms. Fernandez to file the lawsuit and what was going on with her education?
Sure. So Mary Fernandez was a student of Duke University. She had been accepted and was attending the Fuqua School of Business, so her MBA program at Duke. And she started the application process in 2017 and immediately encountered accessibility issues. So the application that was available online was not accessible to screen readers, which means that the coding and the digital content couldn't be read by a software program called a screen reader, which is how blind people typically access material on the web, is a program that reads out loud to them what's on the website or what's on a document. So after that initial experience and a frustrating application process, Ms. Fernandez ultimately ended up going to Duke and going to the MBA program. And she did so because Duke staff assured her that once she arrived, the issues she had with the application process wouldn't reoccur, that Duke was ready and prepared for a blind student in their MBA program. Well, this summer, before you start the MBA program, they have some course prerequisites, and these are online, kind of like webinar tutorial type of programs. And again, immediately realized that these were not going to be accessible for her. One was about, it was a math refresher, and one was about Excel spreadsheets. So Ms. Fernandez contacted Duke and explained that those programs were not accessible. And ultimately the solution was to waive those requirements for her, which meant that Ms. Fernandez entered without the same preparation that her classmates. So after—
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah. So after that experience, as you can imagine, she was probably pretty nervous about starting this MBA program. But again, had been accepted. It's, I don't think anybody can dispute that Duke has one of the top programs in the country. This is a prestigious program. So she started her fall semester, and Duke has, it's not a full block. They have multiple classes throughout the fall semester time period. And she was taking classes that are quantitative classes, meaning that when you're doing math to predict how many people are interested in a product, who is using, remember, this is an MBA program. So these are people in the business world. They're doing lots of calculations, and they're looking at data, and they're trying to predict for the companies that they work for, what's going to be a good product, who's using, different services. So there's a lot of math involved. And when she started that program, she realized pretty quickly that Duke was not able to provide her the information in a format that she could understand and interact with and manipulate. So I admit, I'm not blind. I had to understand her experience as she explains it, which is when you're talking about, for example, a graph or a pie chart. If you are somebody who is has a visual impairment, how are you going to perceive information that by its design is presented visually? So there are a couple of different ways to do that. For complicated equations, you can produce that information using different programs like MathML is a program, but also using Braille, because Braille can have more than one line. So think about an equation. You know, there's multiple lines of numbers. There's different mathematical symbols. And so in Braille, you can present that same information in a tactile format that a person who's looking at that equation might see. And likewise with tactile graphics. So even though I may not be able to see the pie chart, perhaps I can interact with that tactilely. And so that sort of began a very frustrating process for Ms. Fernandez, was realizing that Duke was not prepared and ready to present this complicated math information to her in a way she could understand. And so that's what the case goes out of, is that experience.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about what the law requires of higher education institutions? Because I think that's important to understand, obviously, as it relates to this case, because she's, and along with you and in the National Federation for the Blind, you're suing, right, on the, and she's suing on the basis of some important federal legislation that requires this, yes?
Yes, so the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 has multiple provisions, one for employment, one for public entities, and then one for private entities like Duke University, because it's a private school. So Title III of the ADA applies to private institutions like Duke that offer services to the public. So Title III requires that these entities not discriminate. And as part of that, requires that if a student or faculty member, for that matter, were asking for access to communication, documents, websites, you know, the ability to have equal access to all of that information is part of what Title III requires. And so in some instances, it might mean that the website had to be accessible, meaning that the way it's coded and the way that the platform is presented is natively accessible, meaning it was designed to be accessible. And in some instances, that might mean that documents or other communications need to be produced in an alternate format that the individual can then access using screen readers or using, like, for example, Braille. And then there's also the Rehabilitation Act, which says that any recipient of federal financial assistance, like Duke University and lots of other universities, they get a lot of public money from the Department of Education student loans, but then also from research grants. And you know, there's a lot of federal money that's involved in education. That also has the same requirements as Title III of the ADA, that they provide equal access and where necessary, provide alternate formats.
Right, right. So can you talk more generally about what it is that students with disabilities need from universities, and maybe a little bit about what they encounter when they go to universities with a disability, whether that's a sight impairment or a hearing impairment or some other impairment, and you know, they need that type of accommodation. What do you know about how students are dealing with those issues today when they approach a university and say, hey, I need this accommodation?
Well, the world has changed a lot this year. So, you know, the virtual aspect has made everything both easier and more complicated sometimes. But generally, if a student has hearing loss, then there's going to be a need to make any sort of oral information, AURAL, not oral, ORAL,
right.
Any oral information available. And so in a classroom setting, that could mean that the professor wears a microphone, and that way the person, maybe they wear hearing aids and have an FM transmitter or Bluetooth, or, you know, so much technology now. But that way that communication is captured clearly and can be transmitted directly to students. It also might mean, for example, like on our webinar that we're doing, our meeting today, that there would be captions available so that somebody watching this conversation who had difficulty understanding the oral communications, that they can at least then follow along with the caption. So I mentioned the world has changed. So a lot of things that used to be done in person are now being done virtually. And so that closed captioning for students with hearing loss, like that's going to become something that's more pressing than maybe it has been in the traditional classroom environment. And also for students who are deaf and communicate in American Sign Language. If you're doing virtual classes, you know, what steps are we taking to make sure those students have access to the full, rich communications that may be happening in class discussions and then along just with traditional lecture. For students who are blind, we talked about the need for accessible web platforms. So for example, when somebody who's blind joins Zoom, Zoom announces to them each person that's on the call. That's because Zoom is accessible and they have programmed it to include that information. So if your university or college is using a web platform that isn't accessible, then your blind students are going to have a hard time accessing any sort of course content or course material using the platform. And then thinking about the documents themselves. Is the document readable? Is it properly formatted? And then just a whole other group of students include students with learning disabilities and auditory processing disorders, and you know, being on a screen all day can be really challenging and taxing. So there's a lot of things that are should be taken into consideration, but it can sound overwhelming, but it's not, because what is always what I find to be true is if you talk to a student, they know what they need. It's usually pretty easy to figure out.
Yes.
You have to get the information from them.
Right, right. Which I think sort of speaks to the issue of, we were talking about this a little bit earlier about, you know, this communication with the professors and the faculty in general. I mean, there's a couple of layers here, right, that are at issue. There's the, you know, the asking for the accommodation, then there's sort of the technology piece, there's working with the professor to, you know, help that person understand what's needed. I don't know, what's your sense of that environment right now, or that culture?
So I am not as up to date as personally as I would like to be on how things are going right now, because I think a lot of schools are in the middle of figuring it out. But I do know that traditionally there's been some reluctance on the part of students and some reluctance on the part of staff and faculty to have conversations about disability, and I think there's a lot of potential reason for that. One, students obviously fear disclosure because there's still stigma. There's still cultural issues. And higher education is this unique environment, in particular when you get into these competitive graduate programs, about appearing like, I don't want to say weak because that's not it, but appearing like you're going to struggle, or appearing like you're asking for special favors, or appearing as though you need anything different than any other student. So the culture and stigma piece is one barrier. The other barrier is professors are taught not to give out information about students because of FERPA laws. And there's a lot of concern that, you know, if I talk to somebody about their disability, or if I talk to anybody else about my student who has a disability, am I somehow running afoul of FERPA, which is the Federal Educational Rights Privacy Act. I probably didn't get that exactly right.
No, you got it perfectly right. Yes, we talk about this all the time, and it's part of also actually what I study and talk about with students. So yeah, FERPA is as a federal law has been a big subject of debate and disagreement, but it is very confusing for professors. I will absolutely admit that.
Yeah, so I think the issues around like why students and professors in schools may not be having these candid conversations is in part due to that cultural and the uncertainty about what the law requires. But there's also just, depending on the university, of course, everyone's different, but there are a lot of universities that make it very challenging to get accommodations. So the amount of medical documentation you would have to provide to be eligible? Is it recent enough? Do you have the money to get expensive testing? There's a lot of reasons and barriers why people might not be able to satisfy the medical documentation requirement. So that's it's nuanced. And then what I hear from students who are currently in school is that if your university doesn't have a association or some sort of voluntary group for students with disabilities where they can share their experiences, then that can also feel very alienating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we were talking earlier, the issue of timing in these lawsuits. So there have been kind of a rash of lawsuits lately about web and digital accessibility. And most of those lawsuits have been, the majority of lawsuits have really been in the private sector, you know, regarding companies like Target or airline companies or delivery companies. And, you know, there is a growing set of lawsuits around accommodations in higher education, and particularly digital accommodations in higher education. But the timing in these lawsuits is really different. Can you talk a little bit about what the timing challenges are for students and for litigators?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, when you start a class, you're given a syllabus, and the syllabus says, you know, on Monday, we're going to talk about this. On Wednesday, we're talking about this. And it's just an ongoing march towards the final exam. And so if I don't have access to the materials on Monday, and I go to the Student Disability Access Office, which is what they call it at Duke, or if I go to Disability Services, whatever it's called on your campus, and say, Monday, I didn't have access to my material. So, you know, first, how quickly can they see me? Is it the same week? Hopefully, maybe I can get in and let them know I didn't have access. But if it, let's say best case scenario, you're able to meet with them that same Monday. Well, let's say that the issue can be remediated and you get the material the same week. You're already a week behind in your classes because this was an issue on Monday. You have classes on Tuesday, you have more materials on Wednesday, and you know, time just marches on. And so what we find is that the scenario I just gave you almost never happens, that we're able to remediate accessibility issues that quickly. It just rare, it usually takes weeks and months. And so by that point, students are hopelessly behind in their classes. And what you're going to see is when they take a final exam, you're going to see a measure of what they were denied.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things that I see on my end is that sometimes with students with disabilities, where we're not always, you know, sometimes meeting the challenge the way we need to, either as professors or as an institution, is that, you know, the student is forced to take time off, or the student is forced to take an incomplete. And in some cases, that just has to do with the nature of the disability. But in some cases, it has to do with the fact that we can't always provide what's needed. And so that holds students back, right, from completing. And then
and I just want to add to that, you know, this idea of providing student incomplete or waiving requirements, or you know, trying to find some sort of a workaround.
Yeah.
You know, you're in the heat of the moment, and I understand that you're trying to do what can be done to get the student to the finish line. Right. But a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that if you are waiving requirements, that student is not getting the same education. They're getting a different experience just inherently. And the amount of time and energy that students are devoting to their classes, and we're talking about undergraduate and graduate programs, but you know, I went to law school, so I remember well that you just don't have extra time in your day. It's a very fast-paced program. So every hour that I have to devote to trying to get my materials in an accessible format is an hour that I can't devote to my program, and also it's just exhausting. You know, you're the stress, the anxiety, and you're being pulled in a bunch of different directions. And so I think a lot of people just would assume, well, you make a complaint and folks will do what they can to resolve it, but it usually takes a lot of follow-up. It usually takes finding times where the disability office is available, finding time when you're available. I mean, it's just time consuming, and that's going to put students further behind, and it's just not unnecessarily stressful on top of what's already a stressful situation of not having access to the materials.
Right, right. My friend Haben Gerba, who is a big disability rights activist, always tells her story about being able to access the chocolate cake, you know, and just being able to go to the dining hall and not have to spend 20 minutes just trying to get the menu to know that there is chocolate cake on the menu today. Like, I think that story to me always resonates because, you know, those of us who are able-bodied, like we take for granted the moment of just being able to quickly get at what we need to get at to be able to make decisions about our lives and our education. And it really should be this sort of second nature response from all kinds of institutions, including higher education. I don't know, do you have a sense, Holly, I think is the last question here, what needs to change, what needs to move forward? How is it that we get to a culture where within higher education, the students are not having to spend that extra time? You know, I'm speaking very broadly here, so every case is very different, of course. I think that's part of the challenge. But is there a way to make this stuff baked in from the start?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to digital content, you can have procurement policies that you only buy things that are accessible. So that's, you know, step one is requiring that people go through a process when they ask for new software or new software is suggested. Another thing that we see often when we talk to students with accessibility, document accessibility issues is, you know, it takes time to translate those documents, to convert those documents to whatever format the student needs. And so universities have to start on that before the student has ever set foot on campus. And so that's a process that has to happen quickly and it has to happen efficiently. And so again, when you get back into that, you're trying to catch up posture, when you say my materials on Monday weren't accessible, then you're just constantly trying to catch up. You're never going to catch up. You're already behind the 8 ball. And as for course materials, you know, one very simple way to do it is that there is, again, it's a native accessibility choice that any course materials that are made available in an accessible format from day one. That might mean that in some classes, perhaps there isn't a student who needs it, but in terms of how do you prevent these situations from happening in the first place, you know, all documents provided by professors have to be in accessible PDFs or have to be accessible HTML web pages, or, you know, that's one way to handle it proactively. But, you know, universities are large places and there are a lot of moving parts, and I appreciate that and I know that. But we have seen the ability to make large changes on this scale, and so it just, when accessibility becomes the default.
Yes.
That's, you know, that's the goal, that it's not an accommodation, it's the default. And I would just say, just more broadly, you know, we're talking today about the case that we brought up against Duke University. And, you know, we just want students to be aware and understand that if they're having issues now, Disability Rights North Carolina accepts individual cases from people having problems that are related to their disabilities. So if there are students or people who are friends of students or families of students who are experiencing some of the issues we talked about, they can call Disability Rights North Carolina, and all of our services are free, provided at no cost to people with disabilities, regardless of income. So I just want to make sure people understand we are a resource. We don't merely talk about it. We do try to fix these problems for sure.
Yeah, it's part of the reason I joined the board of directors and that I was so excited to be invited, because, you know, I have students with disabilities in my classes all the time. And for me, you know, the frustration sometimes of just figuring out what I needed to be doing, where, right, I get that help, I get that support, but, you know, there are times that students need more support than what is maybe provided around them. And I think that DRNC just does a fabulous job with that. You all are amazing, just helping students find the resources. I mean, it's about sometimes going to court, it is, but a lot of times it's also about helping folks in the state, helping students in the state find what they need.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we have seen a variety of methods work to resolve these issues. Sometimes direct advocacy with schools and explaining what the student barriers are, because we expect students to advocate for themselves. And, some students have that and some students are still developing that. So asking students to explain to university staff who may or may not feel very sympathetic what they need can be a big lift for students. But sometimes just direct advocacy resolves these issues. Sometimes the internal grievance procedures, every disability services office typically has a posted grievance procedure for students to try to escalate and get attention on the issue they're having more quickly. Sometimes that works. Sometimes complaints to the Department of Education. They have an office for civil rights. And yeah, sometimes lawsuits become necessary, but students have a variety of avenues available to them to pursue their rights. And I've known many students, and I've heard many students say that I should have done something and I didn't, and that's the last thing we would want to have happen.
Yeah, and I don't think we want that on the side of universities either, necessarily. Even if the system is difficult or somehow broken, I think most of us, particularly professors, that's not what we want. We actually do want, most of us, to be serving these students in the way they need to be served. So very much appreciate your time today, Holly, and really appreciate the work that you're doing, and good luck with the case. Maybe we'll come back and talk about the outcome after the first round.
Yeah, and I just also want to add that one of our other attorneys, Larkin Taylor Parker, is also working on the case, and didn't want to forget to thank Larkin for all of their hard work and the assistance on working on this case.
Yeah, it's great when the entities in the disability community band together on these cases. They have a really long-term impact. And they get people talking about these issues, which I think in some cases is as important as the decision. But hopefully the decision will help to move the needle on some of these issues. So thanks again.
Thank you.